I trained in the physical sciences, got a degree in physics, and I stayed on with that. And as a result of that, after many years in the 1990s being sued by a horrendous variety of lawyers for stories about extraordinarily disreputable crooks and medical quacks, around 2000, other firms of lawyers started seeking me out, not to sue me, but to employ me, because a great deal of new evidence was coming into the legal system, the courts, civil cases, investigations, digital evidence coming from computers and digital media. And at that time, there was no real established forensic science of computers, and yet a welter of information came into the court. So I spent a lot of the noughties, not so much working in journalism, but working as a recognized computer forensic expert. So this will be a trial to see, and we can go in different directions depending on your interest, whether you're more interested in forensics for defending yourself or protecting your sources and stories and therefore understanding the attack tools, or whether you are on the investigation or attack side and therefore want to know something about the tools, where to get them, how they work, and what the sort of interesting things are about them. A little bit about myself. My career sort of took off when the government attacked me 40 years ago for exposing the very existence of something that probably everybody does know rather well, and they don't exactly hide anymore, the enormous electronic and intelligence agency of GCHQ Cheltenham. But back in those dark days, when I did a first two-page article in London's Time Out magazine, it was almost unnoticed except by the readership then. But inside the secret world of British intelligence, they went for us. And within 9 months, I and another journalism colleague, the late Crispin Aubrey, and a former soldier, now a social worker, were arrested under Britain's Official Secrets Act. The conversation with our source, John, was typed up from a tape, marked secret, and written top in front of it, and re-stamped top secret. And this led to a major political trial, which in the end ended up in farce, and thus began a long story of disclosure coming out at the same time as the parallel narrative, particularly inspired by Edward Snowden, disclosing the extraordinary scale in which they use digital intelligence to conduct general ubiquitous surveillance. And that of itself is a huge threat to journalism. Right now in Britain, those of you who are involved may know that an investigatory powers bill allowing new means of intrusion into the media that we all use, particularly through the internet, is going through Parliament. It's in the House of Lords at the minute. And the idea in the current British political situation that anyone can do anything about this is really become rather impossible. One of the best people who was pioneering this and actually more politically determined as a conservative, he's called David Davis. I got a nice email from 3 days ago about his campaign using the European courts to knock back what British data surveillance is doing, and saying, yeah, well, we'll get the first judgment out on Tuesday, Duncan, but it's September for the final one. 2 days after that, in this topsy-turvy country that we are having to live in these days, David was appointed as the Secretary of State for Brexit. That's what he felt like. And his colleague in this, a very doughty Labour Civil Liberties campaigner, Tom Watson, is in the middle of plotting to unseat his leader, Jeremy Corbyn. In this milieu, even the limited and sometimes senile, sometimes sharp minds of the House of Lords are rather off focus because bigger things are unpredictable. It's been quite interesting for me, and I'm very happy to talk about that. I felt very ethically challenged when I began this different career. How can I possibly do these things together? They didn't seem to me to work. 15 years later, I didn't have a problem. I've been standing suited in the highest appeal courts. They know I'm a journalist, not least because they were little baby barristers when I was being prosecuted in that case. So our big judges know who I am. And he just said, "Are you still doing journalism?" I said, "Yep." And we moved on. So I have quite significant legal cases, sometimes depending on quite confidential information in the House of Lords on the computer forensics. And it hasn't seemed to be a problem. That is nice, but that was a surprise. That means looking at extraordinary amounts of data, because big data is perhaps very recent for journalism, but for criminal investigations and civil cases, masses of data is common. The typical thing now on any police inquiry, get a raid, get a warrant, they will grab all the digital media first. CDs, sticks, old style discs, spare hard drives, the computers, the laptops, the lot go into the bag as quickly as possible and go into a store. And they, like everybody else, suffer from overload because of that. I'm going to try and take you through the kind of approaches that are used there, the kind of tools. Data can be massive. Those particular CDs will actually intercepted telephone calls. Intercepted in Colombia because you're not allowed to bring British telephone intercepts into evidence, but you can if it's overseas, rather strange. Communications data, the records of what you do with your phone. Sadly, they insist on printing them out, so one single case could produce something like 11 lever arch files of just endless records of who called who. You can't actually analyze these without digital tools used in a large and systematic way. So the fact that they sent it out in paper was really deeply uninteresting and unhelpful, but it does give you an idea of the volume. If they are using digital intelligence, communications data to map out who knows who's called who, the amount of data can be huge very quickly. One case alone, 100,000 call records is typical. I never came across a case where it looked like the attempts to get data were other than proportionate and reasonable and necessary in the particular circumstances of usually a serious crime, a murder, a robbery, child rape, major drugs importations and things like that. And an interesting comparison is actually with the so-called journalist hacking scandal, because the hacking scandal, of course, didn't involve any hacking, as most of us would understand it. Hacking is getting into somebody else's computer and doing stuff. And only on the most minimal basis was what the tabloid journalists did to be described as hacking. They were simply using one means or another to get the PIN numbers for voicemail recordings, and doing it on a systematic and industrial and quite immoral scale. At the same time, Rebecca and some of her chums, cut that from the recording, we shouldn't say that, should we? Were handing out money quite havockly from Rupert Murdoch to bribe public officials to get data, to get access. One quite interesting thing bringing all this together was that the process that I would audit, that the police used, was never actually compromised to journalists on the tabloids trying to hack it away. You would imagine that they would have loved complete records of who called who against all their targets from whom they collected the voicemail. Not an iota of that kind of evidence or information has been found in the hands of the Sun or the News of the World, despite all the disclosures by News International. So, computer forensics is many similar things to journalism. We want to get the facts right. That's a common feature. You want to start from the evidence, build from the evidence, and then be able to go back through the evidence to support what you've said. And that is just as true in journalism involving large quantities of digital material as it is in the computer forensic process. It has to be more exacting in the normal process of criminal cases or civil cases, because a lot may hang on it. People's liberty for years, large sums of money, millions, even billions of pounds can be involved just depending on what is found in the forensics. So the first thing that is normally done is to make it reliable and permanent. Every time you switch on a computer, a tablet, a phone. Every time you go into it, even if you don't know about it, a lot of stuff is changing. Automatic processes kick up, they run, they can overwrite data, they can change time and date stamps. Now you can't change that when it's history, but the invariable practice is as soon as you get to the data, you make a copy that is intact and verifiable. So whatever changes have happened up to that point, they've happened, and you have to deal with it by analysis. So the very first thing to do is, if you come across the media, in whatever context, you make an exact forensic image. There are several standards for doing this. Either the image can be what's called flat, that is to say every bit and byte is reproduced onto the image file. But whereas when a computer is operating, the operating system intervenes, so you never actually know where your data is on the hard drive or the disk, or what it looks like, or what's around it. You don't know if it's moved, got bigger or smaller, been created many times. But when you actually go down to the data level in which the information is stored in the media, you see that it matters. So a flat image is a simple way of doing it. Now you can go on the net, you can very easily find tools and free tools that do flat images. It's very, very standard. It is important to be able to verify that what you have 6 months or a year after the image was made is the same as what was there on the day, on the moment that the digital information came to your possession or the originator's possession. That is normally done by applying a hash function right across the whole of the image. This is a unique mathematical value, some of you may have come across it in other contexts, that is in effect a signature of the whole data. It has the mathematical property that it is, there are vanishingly small probabilities that two different sets of digital data which are actually different will have the same hash. The proofs are out there, the numbers are at the trivial level, that's called a collision. I don't think anybody's ever come across it in computer forensics. So the hash is, if you like, the signature that as to the data. You create the hash at the same time as the image, and you create a hash from the original image. If the hashes match, you have a proof of identity. Now that's a marvelous thing to have in place when you're talking about evidence. And we are talking about evidence because we're looking for truth as journalists, and if we have to stand up our stories, either on a casual level to an editor, or to lawyers, or if we're sued and end up in court, we can say this evidence could not have changed. The cops, if they're honest ones, want to be in the same position. Defendants will always look for things that have gone wrong. The defendants who are less socially valuable have more motive to allege that the process hasn't worked. So the very first thing in forensics is it's not just an image, it's verifiable as the original. And once it is there, it is locked in digital ones and zeros. You can reproduce it as many times. So you could take, if some magical fairy had given us the right to go into one of the banks and just image their computers, we could make an image, we could make it verifiable by creating the hash, and then make 30 copies of it, give one to each of you, and you would all be able to say, in any stories that you then created, it is unchallengeable that I am working for the original data. You could be challenged on your interpretation, which may depend on standard tools. Sometimes things are open to interpretation, but in my experience, it is almost never the case that you will find somebody saying, even if they're a bit sloppy, if they say data is there, it'll be there. They may have interpreted it wrong, they may put a misleading construction on it, but that's okay, because you can see exactly the same as they can see, and you can say, no, this is the better or the real construction. So This affects the processes used for any sort of digital media, your computers, your laptops, your pads, memory sticks, memory cards, and in the future, many domestic devices and similar, and cars now, of course, an example, sat-navs, personal navigators. Every one of these is a digital artifact. It stores data, it's got memory. Make an image of that, and you can see where somebody's been. You can see how a car was being used. So how do you get your digital media? Now here's a difference. In the cases I've worked in, about 150, and they're mostly terrorists, drugs importers, a few murders, and an unsavory number of people accessing indecent images of children. What has happened is that there's been a criminal investigation, usually. Police have gone in, they take all the digital media. The media may go into the store, but they never ever switch the computer on. If the computer, practices have changed recently, and I'll mention that for different reasons, but invariably never switch the computer on. If the computer is on, you have to switch it off and pull out the drives. That's been the practice until fairly recently, because if the computer is running, things will change. You may lose critical data. You just don't know what you're not going to get. So seizure is one route. That's unlikely to directly involve the practice of journalism. But in another area, it does, it will, and it has already, because the use of digital evidence is now very standard in any kind of civil dispute. And many of these quite properly overlap with subjects of journalistic interest, journalistic inquiry, and alliances may be made with one side or another in civil disputes. And the standard there is now called e-discovery. And that's a word worth knowing, it's worth looking at the tools, because you will also find that in general, tools that are made for e-discovery, which tend to be a little bit more accessible, a little bit less expensive than the high-end forensic tools used for criminal cases, are very, very useful tools to use in journalism generally. So the process, in civil process, there will normally be A sues B, and A says, right, you did this, and this is the subject, and B says, no, it was that. But that defines an area for which there will be evidence, and the norm now is that each party must disclose to the other all of their electronic evidence that might relate to the dispute the court will have to judge on. Now that will normally be held within the confidence of the court. Now they are trespassing on the law if they start talking to us as journalists, if I move across the Chinese wall here, but that could happen. And in that case, you want to know that you may want to know how that information is known, how it was disclosed, how it can be tested. The e-discovery process will not necessarily involve the highest end of exactitude, such as full images and hashes, but increasingly these days it does, because you can't beat it. The tools are available. It's quite cheap to do the imaging. It's pretty expensive to do the analysis. Then you may get a leak. That is to say, somebody in a business concerned with malfeasance takes a few hard drives, brings out a computer, borrows a laptop, plugs in a stick, or copies things, or brings out a stick that's in use. If somebody brings you that kind of massive data, you don't just want to copy what the computer can see in it. You want to do the forensics, because there may be amazing stuff there. There may be stuff that would be very important, because you may be being set up. Very, very few people would have the skill to bring something that was fabricated and not leave forensic traces that could be seen with proper viewers that would show that fabrication had taken place. In a later part of this talk, I'll talk about the first of the offshore leaks cases for involving the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, which I'm a founder member 15, 16 years ago. In the first big case, somebody who had worked for offshore services companies had provided hard drives. and these were forensically copied and analysed in various ways. And as the project went public, this was probably the largest project in which I used the full repertoire of forensic analysis tools to look for extra data, to look for any fabrication, anything that would cause a suspicion as to the integrity of the source or whether we were being set up, and to pull out other data from artifacts that were not normally accessible. So information can leak, that's a fact. That will go on, it will happen increasingly. I put the word acquired there. Sometimes people get information as journalists that didn't quite fall into their laps. If that's a memory stick, a CD, a hard drive or something like that, you want to use, if you can, forensic methods to protect it. If something's come through your possession or one of your friends' possessions, shall we say, and it is an original artifact that's been held in the digital environment, forensic imaging is much better than just trying to copy, because when you copy using a Windows or a Mac copy application, all it gets is what might be called live files, the stuff that's there. But there will be masses of stuff in unused spaces in the computer, in unused spaces in files, in things that are operating system files, which are logs of what happened, which can be incredibly revealing. A useful thing to just read is produced by the Association of Chief Police Officers of the UK. It's the ACPO Good Practice Guide for Computer-Based Electronic Evidence. Now, if you cover crime at all, there'll be digital evidence in there. It's interesting to read how they handle it. The most important thing, and you could apply these principles to a media investigation with digital evidence, is the ACPO principles. And all this was written by a pretty odd bunch of British chief police officers. Most people, even around the world, regard these as cardinal principles and very good principles. So, the key things in forensics are you come across the artifact, you capture its data. The imaging tools you can get for free. The higher end tools will do the imaging built in, but two formats are normal. The flat format, sometimes also known as DD, and what's called an EO1 format, which is associated with a program called ENCASE, E-N-C-A-S-E. It's written down there, which was the very first forensics program into the field. Then you get to analysis. Now, these tools tend not to be free. If anybody's spotted a proper forensic analysis tool that's offered for free, please put their hand up and tell us to talk about it. The most common, the gold standard, is ENCASE, written as you see there. Another very common one is FTK, which stands for Forensic Toolkit. One which is much less expensive, much more accessible, and will give you a free imaging program. We'll just have a very quick look at it. Is called WinHex, and you can go to that in the net. And I think you can get a trial of that. Now, WinHex does not have high-end, ultra-sophisticated analysis tools in the way that ENCASE and to some extent FTK does. But a lot of people find it very useful. And if you were in the last class, if you can follow coding at all, then you will come quite easily to a program like WinHex. A critically important thing to do is, this is a different way of looking at the digital data, because you do not allow the computer's operating system to govern what you see. So your forensic program should understand what is a file in the normal trees of files and directories that we're all familiar with, and be able to display that. But it should also go to all the spaces and all the files which are hidden, examine them and analyze them. It will often be equipped with a whole range of interpretation programs so that it can interpret, say, a Word document file, a picture file, according to different formats, and actually verify that that is the correct format for that file. And it can have a look at the end of the file where there may be data from a previous file that could be incredibly useful. But a critically important thing to do after recovery and initial analysis is to index things. I mean, I would say this about all digital investigations, all large-scale journalism these days. You absolutely need your own local Google-like system to cover your data and to work on your computers. And when you're looking at forensics, it's got to be a different kind of text search program, because it's got to actually look at binary things, things that mean nothing, and find ways of handling them and being able to search it, rather than simply going to the beginning of, say, a copy of a hard drive and searching to the end, looking for particular strings of bytes. So why might we use computer forensics in journalism? We may find that we've got digital media to base a story on. Typically, this will not be media coming off the internet. There's going to be very little forensics in something that comes off the internet. Not never, but seldom, because you're getting an end product artifact, be it a file, be it a web page, that has been served up to you, and it is what it is. You're not getting the whole milieu of its creation. Sometimes, however, the creation can be left behind. And the best example of that, very contemporary in Britain now, was the dodgy dossier, the second government report by the British government and Tony Blair seeking to justify the attack on Iraq. The first one you read about in Chilcot, based on utterly flawed intelligence, but the second report was then put out about Saddam's intelligence structures and alleged subversion. This document was rapidly identified as by a Cambridge academic as consisting in large part of plagiarism, including from an identified PhD thesis that he was familiar with. And as soon as this story percolated, I went onto the website, as did others, and grabbed the Downing Street copy of a Word document file before they changed it. And within Word document files, you can find sometimes the whole history of changes and notes of who did them. And so this single file that we all went and grabbed from the internet before Downing Street realized how dangerous this was, revealed that the whole thing had been put together by a bunch of kids in the Downing Street back room, simply cutting and pasting from the internet, and it had then been stuffed out by the government as though it were another intelligence product. So sometimes you can do forensics and stuff that you get from the web, but don't expect to do so. It's when you get the media coming through your hands. And that can be because there's a source. Maybe somebody's thrown out a hard drive. Maybe somebody looks at something that they found in a dustbin or in a rubbish bin, or they buy a second-hand computer and, oh my God, there's accounts of what looks like a dodgy enterprise. These stories sometimes happen. They're never going to happen when you want them, but they happen. Second reason, your own personal data hygiene. If you're going to be subject to investigation, if you're going to cross a hostile border where customs agents might actually take your media and use some of these tools against you, or if you're going to be working in a hostile region or depending on colleagues or their sources who are in a hostile region, where investigating agencies for unpleasant governments will seize media and use these techniques, you bloody well ought to know where the vulnerabilities are. So forensics very important to that. This is not so much, of course, the forensics as the counter-forensics, knowing what's there that you can't see that may actually cause problems and threats to you and your sources. Then you may wish to know about it where you have a journalistic interest in a civil case that is going on, where you have forensic tools being used for e-discovery, and it would be just useful to the humanity and the effectiveness of your investigations to understand what's going on there. And then if you can persuade a source or the collaborator to pass stuff over, you have the tools to understand it, to be able to reach an independent evaluation of its veracity and so on. And if you're just doing straightforward criminal reporting on ongoing cases, you're not doing the slavish journalism of just copying out what the police says, it can be of assistance to understand what the forensic evidence is. So typically the tools will show different windows in an analysis program. I'll put some of that up in a minute. One of the views you will get is a sort of tree structure of directories, the normal folder view that, for example, Windows Explorer will give you on Microsoft computers. There will also be a direct disk view where you are actually looking at the storage space on the media, be it a hard drive or something of the kind, and likely looking through a viewing tool where you can rapidly click from a basic data view, which is normally presented in hexadecimal, a way of representing binary information but on a base of 16. So the numbers will run from 0 to 9 and then letter A to letter F. Hex, and if you can recognize hex strings, is a very useful part of a forensic exercise. For example, files which are deleted can often be recognized by a singular identifying string of hex that is at the beginning of the file and which says what kind of file it is. And if you can then spot where the end of that file is, even though it's a deleted file, you can lift it out, copy it as data, say to your computer, this is a file that's a picture or a document, and it is. Unicode's another standard. There are many types of representation of the data. Unicode is based on having two sets of hex together. And ASCII, we're kind of familiar with, even if we don't know it. It's American data standard for the encoding of letters that we all type. So if you have a view, I'll show you some in a minute, which is presented as hex, it may have meaning as ASCII and will come up as ordinary type and characters in a language you can understand. Unicode is pretty much the same. Creating an index of all the contents allows searches to be done for items of interest according to lists of subjects or keywords that you know about people's names, email addresses. And again, that's can be a whole range. Some of you will know only the basics of searches. I imagine many people here have used very advanced searches on Google. Know how to construct a Boolean or logical search involving multiple terms or ranges of variables such as dates or numbers. There are also what are called real expressions, which are coded ways of saying search for something that is a binary of this or that with many different options. And then the file signature is another aspect. Commonly that will be used to spot file misnaming. So you may think you're a clever clogs because you're going into Repressionistan and you're going to hide your index file of your context. So what do? You change the file extension from doc or txt to JPG, for example, to say it's a picture, or .wav to suggest it's a video file. And so you expect the dumb customs officer to click on that using an ordinary program. Oh, it's a corrupt video file. Well, not if they're doing forensics, that it doesn't matter, because the forensic program will immediately see that it's not that it's misnamed, and in fact by labeling it a WAV file, a WAV file, or other kind of image file, when it is in fact a document file, that's a red flag on the forensic program. The data will be found if it's not encrypted, and there will be a question to ask. So many common schemes fall down in that way. Okay, that's a typical example of an encase screen. This is the tree view on the top left. So this is from a Windows computer. There's a user directory. Ken Mazzota is the user here. There's the documents folder. And the contents of the folder are displayed on the right-hand side. And there are something like 100 items of metadata that you can select to view, just relating to everything that appears as a file. The push buttons choose between looking for data fields, generating a report, looking at it as if it is text, and if it is text, it will appear as text that you can read, or as hexadecimal, doing various kinds of decoding and so on. If it's a picture, you can bring in a graphical viewer and look at it as a picture. But in this pane, typically you will get what just looks like gibberish. The gibberish is just the normal data that you see on the screen. These apply particularly to Windows computers. Mac computers have their own forensics and own approach. I've never worked on detailed forensics for the Apple operating system. The principles are the same, but I couldn't give you all the details. One of the most important things that can be upsets again and again is the concept of unallocated clusters. Now, the unallocated clusters are the parts of the storage on the computer which the computer system does not mark as being in use. That does not mean they are empty. They are almost never empty. Many times data will be moved around, so if you may create a file and then you may save it, and when it's saved in a different location, but your old copy is left behind. It's in these unallocated clusters. They can stay unallocated forever, or for milliseconds, because the computer operating system decides to use that space and stick something there. So the unallocated clusters are where gems are found if people have been doing things that they want to hide, doing things in the past, and so on. In particular, a file that is deleted on the Windows computer will always be there intact in its first. If it has simply been deleted, it's not actually deleted. All that's happened is that a marker is set to show that it should not be seen by the operating system, but there are free programs you can get on the internet which will go across your computer and very easily find everything you've recently deleted using the normal processes. Unless, and if you know how to in Windows, you can cause him to go into unallocated clusters immediately. But the files will still be there. And even if you're doing something that involves access to the web, for example, you choose to, as most people do, access your email on a remote computer, on a server, whether it's Gmail, Hotmail, whatever. So you think to yourselves, oh well, Google's got my mail, but these bastards can't get it from their computer. That's not the case. That's not the case with almost everything you've done on the web. You may not have chosen to store it, but there was a time when it was on your page, and while it was on your page, the computer's memory was holding the image of that page. If that is not then overwritten, it's there to be found. So in a typical operation of a web browser, depending on how you set it, there is a cache of all the data, that is to say a store of all the stuff and all the pages you've seen recently. There's a good reason for that. It means that if you jump back to that page, you don't have to reload it all from the internet. You can get there instantly. So caches have been there for a long time. You can, and most people know how to control what's in the cache. There's usually a privacy setting. You can say, don't cache anything. At the same time as, say, selecting not to store any cookies on that. But that's not going to protect you from the bad guys. It's not going to protect yourselves from the bad guys. Even if your cache setting is 0, there was still a temporary cache when you viewed it. That was stored somewhere. A week from now, will somebody be able to read what you saw on the screen? The answer is maybe. It's always maybe. It could be gone quickly. It could be there for months. So one of the standard programs that most people will use after imaging, after analysis, after indexing, is to run a sort of scouring program through the whole of the space of the hard drive, which is looking for anything using a complicated template that might once have been part of a page you'd viewed, where it came from, and if it can still be recovered. Often modern web pages have many different parts coming from many different places. So the reliability of getting a whole web page back, if it isn't cached after, say, a month, is a bit low. But finding out where the person had gone with their computer, probability is rather high. So these scouring programs, and one is, for example, called net analysis, single word, will go through an image, pull out everything that looks like it might have been part of a web history, pull it into a big database and present it. And I've done many, many cases where you can go back in fragmentary ways and you can see what somebody did 4 years ago. It is actually quite terrifying doing computer forensics. I'm working obviously with stuff the police, in these cases the stuff the police have provided and made available to defense lawyers, but you literally can revisit often the images, the pages that somebody did. And you virtually work out what they're thinking about. You know, they're going through something tacky and then they're going to the cricket score, then they're going to the BBC News, then they're going back to something tacky. When they get to a tacky page, which tacky do they go for? You can see that sometimes. I mean, in one case I was involved in where some unfortunate was accused of browsing for underage images. The police and I were able to reconstruct, in this particular case, exactly the whole session, literally rebuild it, so that second by second you could see what he saw and where he put his mouse, and take that to a jury to say, look, was he really looking for kids or not? So sometimes there's an extraordinary intimacy, particularly in recovering browsing histories, that is really quite scary. Right across the unallocated clusters, whole files, whole directories, stuff from the past and even the remote past, documents, pictures, videos, web pages and emails can be found. Stuff that you see on the web, you think is not retained on your computer, some of it will come through always. If you use some of these privacy protecting tools, for example, CCleaner is a popular one, it'll clear out a lot of the cache, it'll wipe something else. I have never been in a case where people have used these so-called privacy protecting tools and there's nothing left. If they were up to bad stuff, there's always something left. They don't work 100%. And that's quite worrisome, because if you turn that round to the context in which we are the good guys, we're going across borders, we're helping people in NGOs, we're helping sources in difficult countries, then you can't rely on them. You have to take a much more robust approach if you or somebody you're working with as a colleague or a source is in a difficult area. File slack space. When a file is created on a computer, there isn't a little digital cleaning program that says, I'm just going to wipe this all now before I put new data in. So what happens is, if this was a file, and this would be in, say, one cluster, and you say, I don't need this file anymore. So you think that's free space, the computer thinks it's free space, and then you fill in your shopping list, and it comes down to about here, so the file stops here. Computer's still storing this and this. So if MRU and volume shadow copies were enough to get you in trouble with the secret police of country X, you'd be in trouble. So that's file slack. Now that is something that is normally searched for by forensics, because often it's very interesting, because it takes you to an active space in the computer and you get a hint of something that was there before. Some of the privacy programs claim to wipe file slack. I've only ever, the one I use when I use one is called Jetico. But that one I've never seen fall down in failing to clear the slack space. But it's an important issue, another place that data can be left behind. In Windows Computer, there's something called the registry, which is a discrete set of files containing a lot of data about your programs and when they've been run and what's been accessed and what's been used. Typically, the last 20 or 30 document files or Excel files that you've looked at will be stored there. Different applications can create their own forms of history in their own format. They can create it in what's called the app data, the applications data area, which is a hidden directory in Windows computers, or they can create it in the registry. And out of both of these things, another common forensic thing is to obtain lists of MRU, most recently used files. So you're trying to see what's been going on the computer, what somebody has been doing. You go to all the favorite areas for particular files and find out what music you listened to for the past 5 weeks. This kind of thing. Microsoft has also, with increasing complexity, introduced what they call volume shadow copies. These are large hidden areas on every partition, on every hard drive, where data is backed up, ideally so you can recover it in the event of a system crash. Over the years, they've moved from having this type of data simply limited to system files that were essential to the operation of the computer, to actually logging changes you make to documents. And then all of this historical record is bundled into compressed files in quite a complex and unusual format, stuffed into extremely large files with impenetrable names in a completely hidden, user-inaccessible area for the computer. Volume shadow copies are extremely dangerous. It's quite hard, even for some of the best forensic programs, to see what's exactly in them on some levels, and they require a high level of forensic expertise and application to pull out artifacts, but again, they can produce quite devastating artifacts. Another area of forensics, briefly, to do with mobile phones. Every time you're using your phone, there's a record created, whether it's data or voice, of which tower you're logging into, and that is an approximate position even if geographical data from a GPS-enabled phone isn't being taken. So this is a typical list. These are locations, Bradford and Avon. These are places around Bath, Grid Square, and locations for the different cell site transmitters used by one of the networks. Very, very high-end programs are also available to turn what comes from a computer or a set of computers into an investigation. The most sophisticated of them, which is universally used by intelligence agencies, but also by some journalists, is I2. Originally it was a Cambridge company in Britain, now it's I think owned by IBM. But everything that is found is broken down into an artifact with timing data, with email data, call records, and used to comprehensively analyze everything you can see in a large bunch of data. This can include who calls who, what data and what file is related to which other file, where information about artifacts come out and create extraordinarily complex pictures. Now, Stephen Gray, who many of you will know, used it brilliantly to track rendition flights. So he put in a great deal of data from multivarious sources and used forms of network analysis. There's a woman on the New York Times who's a user of I2. It's very expensive, so the number of users. And I've used it 3 or 4 times, and then I've used it for, we used it on not that, but a similar quality program called NUIX on the offshore leaks investigation. And extraordinarily useful now when you've got vast amounts of emails coming out of hard drives. And in our cases, we were looking at companies and agents and principals. And you can build a network analysis diagram of who's mailing who, when, how often, the volume of communications, and so on. Using these tools, you can reduce the detail level or the thresholds on what you see to take away the noise. And if you do that on a network diagram, say within a company where some offshore fund or something is being arranged, as you pull back to just the highest volume communications, you suddenly start to see who's in charge, who's the core group and stuff like that. So intelligence agencies use that all the time on big scraps of digital data. Journalists have used it too. It is part of a sort of leveling that their tools inside the Donut and NSA and the Russian SVR are pretty much the same as our tools. Their biggest mass data analysis is actually based on formats that Google and Yahoo developed. There's no magical gap, but there is a gap in terms of the cost of resources and the number of people. This is another form of forensics that was used to create the offshore database. We had to, this is a very high-end tool used in large-scale data called extract, transform, and load, ETL, if you know it. A program is called Talend, this particular one. And this was used to bring all the data from all the documents together to try and create a layout map of all the companies and all the offshore funds that were in the data. The model was used first for the first offshore leaks and then has been used to build a much bigger data set on top of the same base for the Panama leaks. This was the search tools we created. So we got the hard drives, we put them through the analysis process, checked the origins, checked that the data wasn't going to give away our source. The answer was it could have done a bit, so the data was redacted in ways which I won't talk about, so that any other journalist searching it normally would not be able to pick up an indication of that might have given away the particular source. And it was put into a free text search engine so that the different formats could be analyzed at a single time. We had 12 different indexes for different types of data from 2 different companies. We also put in the actual published results, so you could always check at the same time. These are standard search engines, which I hope everybody's familiar with. You can do some of these type of searches on Google, but it doesn't do many of the best ones. And then you would get a sort of result like that. Now, that was taken from the online version that was pushed out around the world to help people. But we had precisely this, we built precisely the same views just on local network computers when the data wasn't on the internet, so that we could go to any file that we'd found in many gigabytes of data, any email, and be able to analyze it by relevance. Sometimes the data was structured, so we had to devise a presentation format that allowed people to see the contents of a database format in a sort of meaningful way for the stories. And the data extraction that was done by the ETL engine became the offshore leaks database, and it now incorporates Panama leaks, but that's from the first version. A generalized search engine into the data. Most people who write encrypted mails to your average investigative journalist are indulging self-importance to a degree. And that's all right. You know, it's good. It's general sanity. But do you need to worry most of the time? Who, you know, so rather than looking at your tool set or your data first and say, who are my threats? How might I interact with your threats? If your computer is sitting at home and your threat isn't the police, what realistically is the threat that anybody else could get to it? If they're a high-end actor, they're possibly more likely to act by trying to buy a hacker than trying to break in. That will be an increasingly common threat. Do your risk analysis. The question is not how you should do it, but what are you going to do with the media that you're using that could expose you to risk if there is a risk from your data being seen by a third party who doesn't like you? I would do that first. It isn't safe, however, to write something on a memory stick and take that out of your computer and then carry your computer unless you're thinking very carefully about what you're using. If you were going to use very sensitive data in such a way, for example, I would stick to text files, possibly air-gap the computer, and just be very sanguine as to any backups. If you use a very simple text program, it isn't going to be doing any fancy tricks that creates backups that you don't know about. If you start using, God help us, Office 365, unless you've locked everything down, there's probably a copy made instantly to a Microsoft data center, God knows where. It would be impossible to recover history if you use the Tor browser bundled properly, because it does not create it. It does not permit the background processes that may run otherwise in Firefox to leave data behind. If you are using full-on Tails, everybody know what Tails is? Okay, so I mean Tails works by keeping nothing permanently unless you create a secure storage area where some things may be stored. Forensics against Tails, 0 chance. Forensics against the Tor browser, yes, if people make mistakes. If you follow all the rules and you're not a high-value target and being attacked by extraordinary means, then there's going to be no history. Sorry?
Which are the rules you have to follow?
What you'll get with TBB when you download it, they will tell you what to do and what not to do. That's based on the experience and understanding. If I'm advising on counter forensics, one of the awarenesses we now have is that the big intelligence agencies are copying all of this direct off taps on the cables. A lot of what is taught in the journalism security classes really isn't fit for purpose. It's too complex, so it doesn't teach risk analysis first as your first method. One thing that's very useful is proxies. That is to say, internet tools where you create a tunnel out of your computer to another computer in another country, and effectively all the internet communications come from there. Now Tor does that. Tor does that on a grand scale. Although it's used, of course, by the bad guys, it is also used by the incredibly threatened people. And that's why, despite the paradigm and the Tor creates and the history and the hysteria about it, it's very valuable, but the bandwidth available in Tor depends on the number of people who are willing to run the outlet nodes to take stuff that comes in and then put it out to the internet. Because whether we're in Germany or whether we're in this college, theirs is going to be the address on anything that in a large group of unknown users randomly assigned through the Tor system are going to be coming from onto the net. So anybody who does that is being principled, if not actually courageous. The bandwidth they provide will be the bandwidth they pay for. I would not use Tor except when it is necessary for the sake of sparing its capabilities to those who have actual need. Use a proxy. There are many available. They're not expensive. And you can literally go through and say, today I'll be in South Africa. Now I'll be in Minnesota. Next hour, I'll be in Winnipeg, Canada. And that's where your traffic comes from. And that makes, that can be very useful. You know, if you're communicating with somebody you're investigating and you don't want to point it back to you, make it look like you're in Germany. You know, there are times that you are involved in a big story, but you don't have to worry about the intelligence agencies. You know, a fraud story won't involve them. Even if you're working on a drugs cartel, they're probably not your enemy. They might like to know your story, and that's something you should be alert about. But of course, they will know your story when you publish it. So there are many occasions in which you're up against somebody serious, but you assess what the capabilities are. You know, if some business that's out with the defense and aerospace sector is paying bribes overseas, you're not at risk from the big intelligence agencies. And you know, they may have private security organizations, you watch for them, but the capabilities are widely different. I have difficulty with most of the hacker conferences because they're very keen on these cool tools, which are absolutely impossible for people to use. In the ICIJ group, it's gone through successive waves with new projects and new directors, and every time everybody's got to learn PGP. Now, PGP these days is can reasonably well be integrated, but it was not usually so. Every 3 years, people would learn PGP, and when it actually came to matter, they'd lost the skills. They didn't maintain it. So they spent the time, exchanging trivia in PGP, and then when there was an occasion, we needed confidence. The risk analysis on the offshore leaks was very interesting, actually, because there was huge paranoia. I'm in Washington, and all my colleagues, NSA could read this, they could get into our data, and I'm thinking, NSA won't care. GCHQ won't care. We're talking about people who are cheating tax systems. We're going to break them. We're on the same site. So if they happen to see our stuff and have access, they'll be interested, but they won't attack us. They won't try and defeat us. They're not going to look for our files and then tip off the guys who stole $1 billion from Moldova or Uzbekistan. And also, when I analyzed the data, I could see a process was going on. Data had been filtered, been pulled out before it got to us. And when we looked at it in more detail, it broke out into categories for Britain, Australia, and the United States. And I think Canada as well, was one country. And there was a certain amount of collateral information that the people who'd given us the data had sold some of the data first. So my assessment, when we were arguing about the risk of putting stuff out on the big internet so lots more journalists could come in, I said, I think they've got this already. I think you'll find that that not only do we not have to worry because we're not attacking them, they're not threatened by us. So even if they can see into us, which I don't think they will, but they might, we don't need to get worried about it because we're politically not going to harm them. We might force the politicians to move a bit. Well, that's exactly what happened. Cameron moved, and then about 3 months afterwards, when we'd started getting the field data, people went out and they went to talk to some of the tax dodgers. And some of them in Britain, Australia, and America would say, oh yeah, the Inland Revenue, the tax department were around 18 months ago. Yeah, what did they do with you? Oh, I just made them go away or paid $50,000. And a month after that, they came out and said that they'd been working on the data for 2.5 years. So the assessment was right. They had the data. They were no threat to us. We didn't need to max out our security, and we didn't actually go to the max. We were pretty secure. Thanks to the kind of public pressure journalists and Snowden have put up, the penalties for actually doing something that you're not ordered to do are pretty severe and pretty likely to happen. And if you're looking at a company that's in the military sector, they're probably not going to have access to big intelligence agencies' data, but they may have, if they're very big, brought in a few people with some skills who can, use rather superior versions of what people are trying to teach here, say scraping the internet for indications and evidence, breaking into Facebook accounts and things like that. This is not the high level of what intelligence agencies can do. I mean, I've been asked to talk about computer forensics rather than generics of protection, but it is a given, and Britain's National Union of Journalists have got a couple of good publications and articles out on this, and just in the new digital environment, how do you avoid leaving a trace? Telephone call records are automatically stored. We all know that. We all know what itemized bills are. For 15 years, Parliament was sold a deception that the records were only held by the companies. What is extraordinary to me is the lack of outrage. Parliament was deceived. A myth was created that the companies held them for a year and that was proportionate access. What it means for journalism, this was what I was trying to get out, is that any source who's ever contacted you in the last 5 years, if that number is associated with you, if the number they called is associated with you, they can get a complete list in minutes. They can match them to all known phone records, everything else in their database that might relate to the other phone number. So the possibility of doing the history of who's been in touch with a journalist, it isn't even speculation, because one of our regulatory organizations, called the Interception of Communications Commissioner's Office, IOCO, one of these mouthfuls, has actually become rather good. They know their stuff, and they've actually gone proactive. So ahead of the game, they actually used their powers to compel every police force to disclose every occasion that they pulled journalists' records when there wasn't a crime involved. And there were over 100 of them. So that was a threat that was real. It came about through the ordinary use of phones, extraordinarily difficult to defeat. If you're a user, how many people use the Signal app, for example? Right. Well, I mean, I do, but before I used it, I had a spasm of anger because the very first thing that Signal does is steal your contact book. That is intolerable. These people, I mean, it's now come out that there may be engineering flaws in Signal, or it may have been compromised by a secret order, but as soon as I saw that was going to happen, I literally said, there's no way Signal gets near anything but a phone of its own. So now, because 2 or 3 people insist that they have to call me on Signal, I have to carry a separate phone just reserved to them because of the way Signal behaves. The most valuable thing to steal is that contact tree. That's what Facebook wants, that's what all the companies want when they sign you up. Is, you know, get into your social network and see what they can do. We should finish there. Thank you.